Hi, I'm Rosie. Welcome to my How to Make a Bagel video tutorial. This recipe was adapted from the one on the KingArthurBaking.com website. This is the 2/3 mini bagel recipe. It makes 1 dozen awesome, tasty, tiny little bagels, and I hope you really like it. I think this is a really fun and approachable recipe, and I've broken it out step by step for you so that even if you haven't been baking for very long, you should be able to follow the steps and end up with your own dozen mini bagels. One thing to keep in mind is that the whole recipe takes about 16 hours, and while a lot of that is resting time for the dough, that is the full timetable for the recipe. So, with all of this in mind, let's get started. Oh, they look so good. Okay, let's get started with our bagels. First, we'll make the starter. This adds flavor and texture to the bagels. You'll need a large mixing bowl, a 1/16 teaspoon yeast, 1 cup of high gluten flour, a half cup of cool water, and a tea towel or a wrap. So we'll add our yeast. I always like to start with the yeast. And then we'll add our cup of high gluten flour. If you don't have high gluten flour, you can always use bread flour. We really just want something that's got a lot of protein. And then we'll add our half cup of cool water. I usually just get it straight out of the tap. It doesn't have to be colder than that. And then you mix it all together. This it ends up being kind of a very unattractive goop. But you really just want to mix the yeast, the flour, and the water together into a little clump there. That looks pretty good. So then you'll grab your tea towel or plastic wrap, or if you have the reusable wax covers, and cover, and then let it sit overnight or for 14 hours. And here we go, all ready. You can really see the difference in the starter here. It's nice and bubbly and ready to make the dough. For the dough, you'll need 1½ teaspoons yeast, 3½ cups of high gluten flour, 1 cup of warm water, 1½ teaspoons or 11 grams of honey, and 2 teaspoons salt. To the risen starter, we'll add 1½ teaspoons of yeast. Again, I always like to start with the yeast first. And then we'll add our 3½ cups of high gluten flour. Again, you can always substitute with bread flour. Next, we'll add 1 cup of warm water. I usually, again, just get this out of the tap, the hot tap. Makes it easy, and you don't want it too hot because too high of a temperature can kill the yeast. So we'll mix those together. I always like to mix the flour, water, and yeast together first before I add any other ingredients. Now we'll add the 1½ teaspoons of honey. Oh, I'm blocking my shot. And last, we'll add the 2 teaspoons of salt. I always add the salt last because salt and yeast don't really play that well together, so I like to give the yeast as much time on its own as I can. And I switched to just using my little paws there. I like this because I can kind of work all the little clumps, places where the water and the flour can stick together. Yeah, so now you can see I've got my very shaggy lump of dough. This is a really tricky dough to work with, I won't lie to you, but it's totally worth it, and we just take our time. So I like to add a little bit of flour to the surface that I'm working on. This is just my countertop. And I'll take that shaggy dough and I coat it in the flour almost like it's a little chicken nugget or something. And then I start just kneading it. And there's really no beautiful technique. You can kind of see it's falling apart in my hands. But you just the main thing is you want to kind of pull and stretch the dough and then roll it back on itself. And that's about as complicated as it needs to be. So stretching it, rolling it back, stretching it, rolling it back. And I just kind of keep going, and you can see it's sticking to my hand a little bit. So I'm going to add a little bit more flour. This is really going to help me. Okay, so got that floured. Let's speed it up. So I've been kneading for probably about 7 minutes now, and you can see it's gotten so much smoother. Right, when I'm stretching it, rolling it back, it's just so much easier to work with, very smooth. So I'll give it a couple more rolls, and now I'm shaping it into a ball. I always like to do this. And just drop it into the bowl, and you can reuse your plastic wrap or tea towel and just cover it, and we'll let this rise for another 90 minutes or so till it's about doubled in size. So line your baking sheet with a piece of parchment paper and then set it aside. And now I'm going to take my risen dough. It looks really good. And I like to use a kitchen scale. You don't have to, but that's my preference. So what I'm going to do is weigh out 12 equal pieces at 76 grams each. The other option, if you don't have a scale, is that you can just eyeball it. You can just separate it into 12, equal-ish pieces, and that's just fine. So just trim a little chunk and weigh it out. Baking for me is an opportunity to just enjoy a process, so I like to be precise, but everybody's a little different. So here I am just roughly rolling it into a ball using my hands. And then I make a little cup with my hand, and I just roll the dough on the countertop to make a perfect circle. I'll show you from the side as well. So rolling the dough in my hands to get a sort of ball shape, and then placing it on the counter, making a cup with my hands and really using the heel of my hand to shape the dough. And you can kind of see that that cup shape really kind of helps cage the dough and get that perfect dome. It's a really light pressure. And voila, perfect little dough ball. Okay, so this is my favorite part of making bagels. This is making the holes. So I am just using my my thumb and my middle finger to press into the center, and then I create a hole. And then I literally spin it around on my finger to open up the bagel and to smooth out the interior. So we'll just pinch right in the center, create the hole, and then spin it around. It's actually pretty fun. And spinning the last one. Perfect. So our bagels are ready to boil. The boiling process is what gives the bagels its unique texture, both in the crust and on the chewy interior. So I'm adding a teaspoon, actually a tablespoon of baking soda to the boiling water. And what this does is it gives it a little bit more of a bubbly texture on the crust, but you could use honey, or you could use brown sugar or a malt powder. And while I'm doing this, I'm also preheating the oven to 425 degrees. So I like to use that slotted spoon there that I was showing you guys. It's nice and flat so I can really easily scoop the bagels out. I'm also setting up my workspace. I I really appreciate just an easy workspace, so I like to transfer all the bagels from the baking sheet to just a towel. And then in the little sweat marks from the bagels on the baking sheet, it gives me a perfect outline for where to add my toppings. So today I'm using sesame seeds, but you could use everything bagel. You could use caraway seeds. I mean, the possibilities are endless, but This is how I like to set up my bagel assembly line. So drop the bagels into the water, and this is how we know our yeast is ready, is if the bagels float. And I'm going to show you here, the bagels are floating, so we did well. If they don't float, it's not the end of the world. So this is what I call the classic dip and flip. About 2 minutes into the boiling, I flip the bagels over by just dipping and flipping. And now they've had 2 minutes on each side. So I am going to scoop out the bagels and let them rest for maybe just a minute on the towel before I transfer them to the baking sheet with the toppings. And once I fish these out, I'll put the next batch in. And this is about how I like to work. I kind of throw a couple into boil and then do toppings for the other ones and just kind of work in that little assembly line. So I am rolling the top of the bagel into the seeds, and they kind of stick just naturally because the bagels are just fresh out of the water, so they're sticking. And I also bake everything face down, so this way the seeds don't burn. So I'm adding the last bagel here, and again I'm going to keep them face down. We've got our oven preheated to 425 degrees, and it's time to bake. Here I am putting the bagels in the oven. And this is about 8 minutes into the bake. I check, and I always put a piece of foil on the bottom so they don't burn. And it's been 20 minutes of baking. I'm squinting a little bit just because it's hot. But you'll see here how the foil looks on the top. And that's just to protect them, so I get a nice golden brown. And here we go, bagels.